News. President Trump says Pam Bondi is out as U.S. Attorney General. The president made the announcement just moments ago on Truth Social. Sources tell ABC News the primary reason for her removal is President Trump's frustration that she's not been effective in prosecuting his political targets. Let's get right to our senior political correspondent, Rachel Scott. Rachel, what's the latest here?
Well, the president just announced this on social media just moments ago. I want to read to you what the president is saying as he is announcing.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. What unfolded in that federal courtroom has sent shockwaves through Washington. And if the allegations described during the proceeding hold up under further scrutiny, the political and legal fallout could be enormous. According to testimony delivered under oath, former Attorney General Pam Bondi described receiving directives from Donald Trump that she characterized as improper and, in some instances, illegal. The courtroom reportedly fell silent as one of Trump's most trusted allies, someone selected to lead the Department of Justice and defend the administration's agenda, appeared to shift the narrative in a dramatic and unexpected way.
That Pam Bondi will no longer serve as Attorney General of the United States. He calls Pam Bondi a great patriot, saying that she has faithfully served as Attorney General over the past year, saying that she has done a tremendous job when it comes to a crackdown in crime. The president says that the administration loves Pam, but that she's going to be moving on to a new job in the private sector. He then adds that the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, will now be serving as the acting Attorney General of the United States.
This wasn't an anonymous source leaking information to reporters. It wasn't a former official writing a memoir years after leaving office. This was testimony delivered in a formal legal setting, under oath, where every statement carries potential legal consequences. According to the account presented during that proceeding, Bondi acknowledged that politically sensitive decisions involving prosecutions, the handling of Epstein-related materials, and structural changes within U.S. attorney offices were made under direct presidential direction. If investigators interpret those statements the way critics already are, the implications could be profound. For years, one of Trump's most consistent defenses against allegations of abuse of power has been the argument that he never personally ordered the conduct in question.
Welcome that criticism. Keep putting the pressure on. He's certainly responding to a lot of those accusations and showing that he'd be willing to go a step further, Diane.
Rachel, thank you. And I want to bring in ABC News Chief Washington correspondent John Carl for more on that. John, as Rachel mentioned, sources say the president was frustrated with ineffective prosecutions of his political rivals and also Bondi's handling of the Epstein file.
The claim has been that subordinates acted independently, exercising their own judgment without explicit instructions from the Oval Office. But according to the testimony described in court, Bondi's account challenges that defense directly. And that's why the reaction behind the scenes, according to reports from people familiar with the situation, has been described as one of frustration and alarm. Because if a former attorney general is now saying under oath that presidential directives shaped these decisions, investigators no longer have to rely solely on circumstantial evidence or inference. They would have testimony from the person responsible for carrying out those instructions. Legal analysts are paying close attention to the combination of Bondi's statements and previous court findings.
Look, in terms of the president himself, he was upset, and he expressed some of this actually publicly, that Bondi hadn't more aggressively tried to prosecute his political enemies, which is really quite a statement, quite a fact when you consider that it was Bondi's Justice Department that brought indictments against James Comey.
In one area involving the restructuring of a U.S. attorney's office, a federal judge had already ruled that the conduct violated federal law. That judicial finding addressed the legality of the actions themselves. What Bondi's testimony allegedly adds, according to critics and observers, is a direct link connecting those actions to presidential instruction. In other words, one piece of the puzzle addresses whether the conduct was unlawful, the other addresses who allegedly ordered it. Taken together, supporters of further investigation argue that this creates a significantly stronger evidentiary record than either element standing alone. And that's where this story becomes even more explosive. Because Bondi's testimony, as described during the proceeding, didn't stop at administrative restructuring. It extended into some of the most politically sensitive subjects connected to Trump's presidency.
Deputy Attorney General will now be the acting Attorney General. Now, Blanche is somebody who, of course, is the president's former personal defense attorney, has shown quite a bit of loyalty, but it's unclear what he would be able to carry out that Pam Bondi has not been able to carry out in terms of these politically charged cases against the president's enemies.
One of those areas involved the handling of materials related to Jeffrey Epstein. Bondi had previously made public promises regarding transparency and the release of certain Epstein-related files. But according to the sworn account presented in court, she later received direction that altered how those materials would be handled. Critics argue that this explanation helps answer questions that have lingered for months about why promises of transparency appeared to collide with decisions limiting further disclosures. If investigators view Bondi's testimony as credible, the focus of any inquiry could shift dramatically. Instead of asking whether bureaucratic processes delayed or prevented disclosures, investigators may begin asking who ultimately made those decisions and why. Then there is the issue of politically sensitive prosecutions. According to the testimony described in court, Bondi characterized certain directives regarding prosecutorial decisions as improper. Those allegations strike at the heart of one of the Justice Department's most important principles, that charging decisions should be based on evidence and law, not political loyalty or personal grievances. Legal experts have long warned that using prosecutorial authority to target perceived political opponents would represent a serious abuse of power. Supporters of Trump reject that interpretation entirely, arguing that political opponents and media critics have repeatedly distorted events to fit a predetermined narrative. They maintain that the administration pursued legitimate law enforcement priorities and that allegations of political weaponization are exaggerated or politically motivated. Critics, however, point to Bondi's own descriptions of the directives she allegedly received and argue that testimony from a former attorney general carries unusual weight. After all, these aren't the words of a cable news commentator or partisan activist. They are allegations attributed to the person who once occupied the nation's highest law enforcement position. Perhaps the most consequential aspect of this entire story isn't simply what Bondi said, it's what happens next, because testimony of this nature can dramatically alter legal strategy. Investigators may examine whether Bondi herself now faces personal legal exposure for actions she carried out while serving as Attorney General. That possibility raises another critical question: whether cooperation with investigators becomes the most practical path forward for someone seeking to minimize their own legal risk. Bondi possesses first-hand knowledge of meetings, conversations, directives, and decision-making processes that few others could describe from direct experience. Every witness facing potential exposure eventually confronts the same calculation: continue defending past decisions or cooperate with investigators in exchange for more favorable treatment. Whether Bondi reaches that point remains unknown. What is known is that testimony given under oath tends to reshape the legal landscape. Beyond the courtroom implications lies an even broader institutional question. The Department of Justice has long been expected to operate independently of political influence. The principle is foundational. Prosecutors are supposed to follow evidence, not presidential preference. Attorneys general are expected to safeguard that independence, even when it means resisting pressure from the administration they serve. If the allegations described during this proceeding are ultimately substantiated, critics argue they would represent one of the most significant challenges to that principle in modern American history. Supporters of Trump are likely to view the situation very differently. They argue that accusations against him have repeatedly emerged without producing convictions on the most serious allegations, and they warn against treating contested testimony as established fact before the full legal process has played out. That divide ensures this story is far from over, because what happened in that courtroom wasn't merely another headline competing for attention in an already chaotic news cycle. It was a moment that, depending on how investigators, prosecutors, and the courts ultimately assess the testimony, could redefine how this chapter of presidential accountability is understood. For years, the central question surrounding allegations of DOJ politicization has been whether controversial decisions reflected institutional drift or direct presidential instruction. According to the testimony described in this proceeding, that question may now have a very different answer. If the allegations prove accurate, the line connecting the Oval Office to those decisions has become clearer than ever before. And if that line holds under scrutiny, the consequences could extend far beyond headlines and political talking points. They could shape the next phase of one of the most consequential legal and constitutional battles the country has seen in recent memory. Watch this story closely, because whatever comes next, Washington won't be looking away. But if you think the story ends there, think again. Because the testimony itself may only mark the beginning of an entirely new phase of scrutiny. one that extends beyond individual allegations and into the broader question of how power was exercised at the highest levels of government. For investigators, testimony delivered under oath isn't simply another headline dominating the news cycle. It's evidence. It's a formal statement that can be tested against documents, emails, witness accounts, phone records, meeting schedules, and previous public statements. Every detail can be examined. Every timeline can be reconstructed. Every inconsistency can become the focus of additional questioning. And that's why legal observers say the significance of Bondi's alleged admissions isn't limited to what was said inside that courtroom. It's about what those statements could potentially unlock. Because if investigators decide to move forward, they now have something they didn't necessarily have before, a roadmap. They know which meetings to revisit. They know which officials may need to testify. They know which communications could become relevant. And perhaps most importantly, they know exactly where to begin asking follow-up questions. According to the testimony described during the proceeding, Bondi wasn't operating in a vacuum. She wasn't portraying herself as an independent decision-maker exercising complete discretion over politically sensitive matters. Instead, the picture she painted suggested a chain of command that extended directly upward. That distinction matters. In many high-profile investigations, establishing intent becomes one of the greatest challenges prosecutors face. People rarely issue explicit instructions in writing. Decisions are often communicated indirectly. Layers of bureaucracy create distance between leadership and implementation. As a result, investigators frequently rely on circumstantial evidence to determine who knew what and when. But testimony from someone who says they personally received those instructions changes the dynamic entirely. Suddenly, investigators aren't reconstructing events from fragments and assumptions. They're evaluating the account of someone who claims to have been in the room. And that transforms the legal conversation. Of course, testimony alone does not determine guilt. Statements made under oath can be challenged, tested, corroborated, or contradicted. Defense attorneys would almost certainly scrutinize every aspect of Bondi's account, examining motivations, timelines, previous statements, and any inconsistencies that could affect credibility. Supporters of Trump have repeatedly argued that accusations against him often collapse under closer examination. They point to years of investigations, congressional hearings, and media controversies that generated dramatic headlines but failed to produce the outcomes critics predicted. From their perspective, caution remains essential. Allegations, they argue, remain allegations until they are proven in court. Critics, however, view the situation differently. They contend that this isn't simply another former official offering retrospective criticism after leaving office. Testimony given under oath by a former attorney general occupies an entirely different category. The Department of Justice isn't just another federal agency. It's the institution responsible for enforcing the nation's laws. And the attorney general isn't merely a political spokesperson. It's one of the most powerful legal positions in the country, which is precisely why Bondi's alleged characterization of the directives she received has generated such an intense reaction. Because if the nation's highest-ranking law enforcement official is describing presidential instructions as improper or illegal, critics argue that the public has an obligation to understand exactly what happened. And understanding what happened may require looking beyond headlines and into the mechanics of how these decisions unfolded. Who attended the meetings? Who was present when those discussions took place? Were objections raised? Did anyone resist? Were concerns documented internally? Did career officials push back? Were warnings ignored? Those questions don't disappear once testimony concludes. If anything, that's when they become even more urgent. Then there's the political reality surrounding all of this. Washington has witnessed dramatic testimony before. Officials have made explosive claims. Investigations have dominated headlines and consumed public attention. But rarely does a controversy involve someone who occupied the Attorney General's office while simultaneously describing alleged presidential directives touching multiple sensitive areas at once. The Epstein-related decisions, the allegations involving politically motivated prosecutions, the restructuring efforts already examined by federal courts. Each category carries its own legal and political implications. Together, they create a narrative that neither supporters nor critics can easily dismiss. For Trump's opponents, the testimony represents potential confirmation of concerns they've raised for years regarding the politicization of law enforcement institutions. For Trump's allies, it represents another chapter in what they view as a continuing effort to undermine him through legal and political attacks. Those competing narratives aren't likely to fade anytime soon. If anything, they're likely to intensify. because the next phase of this story won't unfold primarily on television panels or social media feeds. It will unfold through subpoenas, document requests, witness interviews, and legal filings. Behind closed doors, investigators will compare testimony against evidence. Attorneys will prepare responses. Potential witnesses may reassess their own positions. And officials who once believed certain conversations would remain private may find themselves confronting difficult questions under oath. The pace of these developments may frustrate those expecting immediate answers. Major investigations rarely move quickly. Evidence has to be reviewed, claims must be verified, witnesses have to be interviewed, legal standards must be met, and despite the intensity of public attention, the justice system often moves far more slowly than the news cycle. But that slower pace shouldn't be mistaken for inactivity, because some of the most consequential developments happen outside public view. The public sees headlines, investigators see evidence, the public hears testimony, prosecutors evaluate whether that testimony can be supported. The public reacts emotionally to dramatic revelations. Courts focus on admissibility, credibility, and proof. And somewhere between those two worlds, the world of politics and the world of law, the future of this story will ultimately be decided. One thing, however, is already clear. The testimony described during this proceeding has ensured that questions surrounding the Department of Justice's independence during this period won't simply disappear. The debate has moved beyond speculation. It has entered the realm of sworn accounts, legal records, and institutional scrutiny. Whether those allegations withstand the full weight of investigation remains to be seen. Whether additional witnesses emerge remains unknown. Whether prosecutors ultimately determine that criminal charges are warranted is a decision yet to be made, but what happened in that courtroom has undeniably raised the stakes. Because if the allegations described under oath are substantiated, they won't merely reshape public understanding of a presidency, they could redefine how future generations understand the relationship between political power and the institutions designed to constrain it. And if they are not substantiated, the proceeding itself will become another example cited by those who argue that accusations often outpace evidence in America's political battles. Either way, the consequences are enormous. The questions are multiplying. And the next chapter of this story may prove even more consequential than the testimony that brought us here in the first place. And perhaps the most extraordinary part of this entire situation isn't the testimony itself. It's the position it places everyone connected to these events moving forward. Because once testimony enters the official record, people who may have assumed their involvement would remain buried inside bureaucratic processes suddenly face a new reality. Investigators don't stop with the headline. They work outward from it. Who else knew? Who else participated? Who signed off? Who raised concerns? Who stayed silent? And who may now decide that speaking openly is in their own best interest? That's the domino effect legal experts often describe in major investigations. One witness creates pressure on another. One account leads to requests for documents. One disclosure prompts new interviews. What begins as a single dramatic moment in a courtroom can evolve into an entirely different phase of accountability. If Bondi's testimony ultimately proves accurate and withstands scrutiny, it could encourage others with first-hand knowledge to reconsider their own positions. Former aides, career Department of Justice officials, staff members who attended meetings, individuals who witnessed conversations but chose not to speak publicly at the time. The psychology of investigations can shift rapidly once someone at the center of events breaks ranks. For years, one of the defining characteristics of controversies surrounding Trump has been the reluctance of insiders to publicly describe direct presidential involvement under oath. People issued statements through attorneys, sources spoke anonymously. Former officials hinted at concerns only after leaving office. But critics argue that testimony from a former attorney general belongs in an entirely different category. It's difficult to overstate the symbolic weight attached to that office. The Attorney General serves as the federal government's chief law enforcement officer. The position carries extraordinary responsibility and public trust. Americans are conditioned to believe that the person occupying that role functions as a guardian of legal independence rather than an extension of political loyalty, which is precisely why the allegations described during this proceeding have generated such intense attention. Because if the person who once led the Department of Justice is now saying that the institution's independence was compromised by improper directives from the president, critics argue that the public deserves answers. Not assumptions, not partisan spin, answers. At the same time, supporters of Trump continue urging restraint. They argue that testimony should never be confused with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Witnesses can have motivations, memories can be imperfect, legal proceedings can become politically charged environments where competing narratives collide. They caution against treating allegations as settled fact before all of the evidence has been examined and tested, and that distinction matters. In America's legal system, testimony is a starting point for investigation, not necessarily its conclusion. But even viewed through the most cautious lens possible, the significance of what allegedly occurred in that courtroom remains difficult to ignore, because the story is no longer confined to questions of political optics. It's about institutions. It's about whether safeguards designed to prevent political influence within the justice system functioned as intended. It's about whether career officials felt empowered to object. It's about whether concerns were documented and elevated through proper channels. And ultimately, it's about whether the public can maintain confidence that justice is administered fairly regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. Those questions transcend party affiliation. Democrats and Republicans may disagree sharply about Trump's presidency, his intentions, and the credibility of those making accusations against him. But the expectation that the Department of Justice should remain independent has historically been one of the few principles capable of attracting bipartisan support. When confidence in that independence weakens, the consequences extend far beyond any single administration. Public trust erodes. Future investigations become harder to separate from political narratives. Every prosecutorial decision risks being viewed through a partisan lens, and restoring confidence once lost becomes extraordinarily difficult. That's why legal scholars often describe institutional damage as the hardest consequence to repair. Court cases eventually conclude. Administrations change. Election cycles come and go. But public faith in the integrity of institutions can take decades to rebuild. And that's precisely why this story resonates so deeply. Because depending on how the evidence develops, Americans may ultimately conclude one of two very different things. Either the testimony described in this proceeding exposed serious misconduct demanding accountability at the highest levels of government, or the allegations will fail to withstand scrutiny, reinforcing arguments that politically explosive claims often outpace the evidence supporting them. There is very little middle ground between those outcomes. One interpretation reshapes how history remembers the Justice Department during this period. The other reshapes how future generations view allegations of institutional abuse. Either way, the stakes could hardly be higher. As investigators, lawmakers, journalists, and legal analysts continue examining what was said under oath, one reality remains unavoidable. The story isn't ending. It's evolving. The testimony may have concluded, but the questions it raised are only beginning to be explored. Were these isolated incidents or part of a broader pattern? Will additional witnesses emerge? Will documentary evidence support or contradict the sworn account? Will prosecutors determine that further action is warranted? Or will the allegations collapse under the weight of closer examination? Those answers won't arrive overnight. But when they do, they could fundamentally alter the public understanding of one of the most contentious periods in modern American political history. Until then, every development matters. Every filing matters. Every witness matters. Because sometimes the moments that define an era don't arrive through dramatic speeches from podiums or election night celebrations. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a courtroom, under oath, when someone once entrusted with protecting the system begins describing how that system allegedly operated behind closed doors. And if the allegations raised during this proceeding are ultimately borne out by the evidence, historians may one day look back on this testimony as the moment the narrative changed, the moment questions turned into formal allegations, the moment speculation gave way to sworn accounts, and the moment the country was forced to confront what may have been happening inside one of its most powerful institutions. So watch carefully, because whatever the final outcome may be, the next phase of this story has the potential to shape not only legal accountability, but the public's faith in the institutions meant to uphold the rule of law itself. And those consequences could last long after the headlines fade away.